The second Deputy Scott Mercer saw the golden retriever dart into the house. His heart jumped into his throat. "This place is supposed to be empty," he shouted, slamming the car door behind him and taking off at a run. His partner, Officer Jeff Daniels, was just a step behind. The abandoned house at the edge of town had been nothing but an eyesore for years, but now it was about to become the center of something much bigger. The dog, a scruffy, dirt-covered golden retriever, had come out of nowhere, bolting across the road and straight into the open doorway of the decayed house. Mercer had barely hit the brakes in time to avoid hitting the poor thing. His gut told him there was something wrong. Dogs didn't just run into abandoned buildings for no reason. Mercer and Daniels reached the door, guns holstered but hands tense. The smell of mildew, dust, and something else, something faint but unpleasant, hung in the air. "Buddy," Mercer called out softly, stepping inside. "Come on, let's get you home." No response. Only silence. Daniels took a few cautious steps forward, his boots scuffing against the warped wooden floorboards. The dim light filtering through broken windows cast eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The house had clearly been left to rot for years. Dust coated everything, and cobwebs clung to the corners like forgotten memories. Then, a sound, soft but unmistakable. A whimper. "You hear that?" Daniels asked, his voice low. Mercer nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The whimper came again, from deeper in the house. "Come on," he murmured, moving toward the sound. They pushed forward, past broken furniture and old newspapers littering the floor. The air grew thicker, and the whimpering became more urgent. Then, as they reached what must have once been a dining room, they found him. The dog sat beside a large wooden cabinet, one paw resting against the door. His golden fur was matted and dirty, his ribs slightly visible beneath his coat. But he wasn't just sitting there. He was trying to open the cabinet, scratching at it, his tail wagging slightly despite his exhaustion. Mercer exchanged a glance with Daniels before kneeling. "What is it, boy?" He reached out carefully, running a hand over the dog's head. The retriever gave him a brief look, then returned to scratching the cabinet. Daniels frowned. "Something's in there." Mercer hesitated only for a moment before reaching for the cabinet door. The handle was rusted, but with a little force, it creaked open. Inside, huddled in the shadows, was a child. A little girl, no older than 5, stared up at them with wide blue eyes. She was wrapped in an old blanket, her blonde hair tangled and dirty. For a moment, she didn't move, as if unsure whether they were real or another trick of the darkness. "Hey there, sweetheart," Mercer said softly, lowering his voice. "You're safe now." The girl didn't speak. She clutched the edges of the blanket tighter, her tiny fingers trembling. Daniels let out a slow breath. How did she even get here? The dog nudged closer, resting his head on the girl's lap. She reached out hesitantly, placing a small hand on his back. "She's been with him," Mercer murmured. "This dog, he's been protecting her." The weight of the moment settled over them. An abandoned house, a lost child, and a dog who had refused to leave her side. The questions swirled in Mercer's mind, but first things first, getting her to safety. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Mercer. We need immediate medical assistance at the old Morrison house. We have a found child, approximately 5 years old, conscious but unresponsive. And we've got a dog. Looks like he's been watching over her." "Copy that, Deputy. Sending an ambulance now." Mercer turned back to the girl and the dog. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, giving the retriever another gentle pat. "Real good." The dog thumped his tail against the ground, watching as Mercer carefully reached for the child. "Let's get you out of here, sweetheart," he said softly. As he lifted her into his arms, the dog stood up beside him, never straying more than an inch away. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever had brought them here, one thing was certain. The golden retriever had never left her side. And Mercer had a feeling he never would. Mercer stepped out of the abandoned house with the little girl cradled in his arms. The retriever trotted beside him, his amber eyes fixed on the child as if he had made it his life's mission to guard her. The distant wail of an approaching ambulance broke the silence, the blue and red lights flashing against the dreary backdrop of the neighborhood's neglected homes. The little girl clung to Mercer's shirt, her grip weak but insistent. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, he wasn't sure. Her face remained blank, her lips slightly parted, but no words came. Just the wide, searching gaze that made something deep in Mercer's chest tighten. Daniels jogged ahead, waving down the ambulance as it pulled up. The paramedics jumped out, their faces a mix of relief and concern as they rushed over. "She's been in there for who knows how long," Mercer told them. "Unresponsive, but conscious. Found her in a cabinet with this dog keeping watch." The paramedics nodded, immediately wrapping the girl in a warm blanket and checking her vitals. Mercer gently transferred her to the stretcher, but as soon as his arms loosened, she let out a small, broken whimper and reached for him. The retriever whined and pressed closer to the stretcher. Mercer glanced at the paramedics, who gave him a knowing look. "You can ride with us if it helps," one of them offered. He nodded. "I think it will." The retriever tried to hop in as well, but one of the paramedics held up a hand. "Sorry, buddy. We can't let you in the ambulance." The dog whined again, stepping back but keeping his gaze locked on the little girl. Mercer hesitated before turning to Daniels. "Can you take him? We can't just leave him." Daniels sighed, but nodded. "Yeah, I'll bring him in my car." Mercer patted the retriever's head. "Don't worry, buddy. We'll see you soon." The dog didn't seem reassured, but he obediently followed Daniels toward the patrol car while Mercer climbed into the ambulance. As they sped toward the hospital, he kept his eyes on the little girl. She lay still, her eyes fluttering between wakefulness and exhaustion. "You're safe now," he murmured, not sure if she could even hear him. "We'll figure everything out." At the hospital, the little girl was taken in for evaluation. Mercer stayed as close as they allowed, answering the doctor's questions while watching through the observation window. They cleaned her up, dressed her in fresh clothes, and ran tests to check for malnutrition or injuries. The dog arrived not long after, tugging Daniels along with the leash someone at the station had found. As soon as the retriever caught sight of Mercer, he pulled harder, practically dragging Daniels down the hallway. "He's been antsy since we got here," Daniels grumbled, letting go of the leash as soon as they reached the waiting area. "I think he's more worried about her than we are." Mercer crouched down as the retriever reached him. "She's okay, buddy. They're taking care of her." The dog licked Mercer's hand before sitting down, his ears perked toward the door leading to the pediatric ward. Daniels sighed, rubbing his face. "So what now? We call child services?" Mercer exhaled. "We don't even know her name. No ID, no missing child reports matching her description so far. We need to wait until she talks." A nurse poked her head into the waiting area. "Deputy Mercer?" He straightened. "Yeah?" "She's awake, and she's asking for you." Mercer exchanged a quick glance with Daniels before following the nurse. The retriever started to follow, but a firm look from the nurse stopped him in his tracks. The dog whined, but sat back down, watching the door with intense focus. Inside the small hospital room, the little girl sat up in the hospital bed, her tiny fingers clutching the blanket. Her eyes flicked up as Mercer entered, and for the first time since he found her, she spoke. "Charlie." Mercer frowned slightly, stepping closer. "Charlie?" She nodded slowly. "His name?" Mercer glanced back at the closed door, as if Charlie might have somehow heard her from the other side. "The dog?" Another small nod. He crouched beside the bed, keeping his voice soft. "That's a good name. Can you tell me yours?" The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening on the blanket. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Emma." Mercer offered her a reassuring smile. "That's a pretty name, Emma. Can you tell me where your family is?" Her lower lip trembled, and she shook her head. "Don't know." Something about the way she said it, so small, so lost, made Mercer's stomach turn. "Okay, it's all right. You're safe now." Emma's fingers twitched against the blanket. "Charlie kept me safe." Mercer nodded. "Yeah, he did. He's right outside. You want to see him?" A flicker of something, relief maybe, crossed her face. She gave another tiny nod. Mercer stood and opened the door. Charlie, who had clearly been listening, bolted into the room before anyone could stop him. He leapt onto the bed, his tail wagging so hard it made the blankets rustle. Emma let out a soft giggle, her small hands finding his fur. Mercer stepped back, watching them. Charlie licked Emma's cheek, then curled up beside her, his body pressed close as if he had no intention of leaving her side ever again. Emma buried her face against his warm coat, her little body relaxing for the first time since they had found her. Daniels appeared at the door, shaking his head. "Well, looks like they're a package deal." Mercer crossed his arms, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, looks like it." There was still so much they didn't know. Where Emma had come from, how she had ended up alone in that abandoned house, what had happened to her family. But one thing was clear. Charlie had kept her safe through it all, and he wasn't going to stop now. Mercer sat in the hospital waiting area, rubbing a hand over his face. He hadn't realized how tired he was until now. It had been a long night, and there were still too many unanswered questions. Daniel sat beside him, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, while Charlie lay at Mercer's feet, his golden fur rising and falling with each slow breath. The dog had refused to leave Emma's side, but after some coaxing, he had settled near Mercer, his ears twitching every time a nurse passed by. "You think she's ready to talk more?" Daniels asked, breaking the silence. Mercer exhaled. "Maybe. She was willing to tell me her name and Charlie's. That's something. Still no sign of her parents? Nothing. No missing persons report that fits. Nothing in the system." Daniels leaned back, shaking his head. "It's like she just appeared out of nowhere." Mercer frowned. "No one just appears. Someone, somewhere, knows this kid." Just then, the nurse from earlier poked her head into the waiting area. "Deputy Mercer?" He stood immediately, Charlie's head lifting in sync. "Yeah?" "She's asking for you again." Mercer exchanged a glance with Daniels, who gave a slight nod. "I'll wait here with the mutt." Mercer followed the nurse down the hall, his boots echoing lightly on the tile floor. He stepped into Emma's room, where she sat up in bed, clutching Charlie's leash in her small hands. Her hair had been washed, her face scrubbed clean, but there was still a shadow of exhaustion in her eyes. "Hey there, kiddo," Mercer said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How you feeling?" Emma hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Okay," he smiled. "That's good. You remember me?" A tiny nod. You found me. That's right. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Emma, can you tell me anything about what happened? How you ended up in that house? She gripped the leash tighter. We were hiding. Mercer's jaw tensed. Hiding from who? Emma's eyes darted toward the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. She whispered, Bad man. Mercer's spine straightened. A bad man? Do you know his name? She shook her head quickly. He was scary. Charlie kept me safe. Mercer's mind raced. Did this man take you there? Did you live in that house? Emma shook her head again. No, we ran away. From where? Emma bit her lip, struggling to remember. A place with a lot of trees. A big house. Mercer reached for his notepad. Can you tell me anything else? Anyone else who was there? She hesitated. Mommy was there. And my brother. Mercer's pen paused. Your brother? What's his name? Her voice was even softer now. Ben. A lump formed in Mercer's throat. Where is Ben now? Emma's fingers twisted around the leash. I don't know. The bad man came. Mommy told me to run. Ben was supposed to come too, but he didn't. Mercer felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice calm. Emma, do you know where this big house is? She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. I just remember trees. Lots of trees. Mercer reached out, placing a gentle hand on her small one. We're going to find your family, okay? We'll make sure they're safe. Emma sniffled, but nodded, gripping his hand tightly. Charlie let out a soft whine, nudging his nose against her cheek. She buried her face in his fur, her tiny shoulders trembling. Mercer stood and stepped into the hall, his mind racing. Daniels was already on his feet when he saw Mercer's face. What is it? Mercer exhaled. She's got a brother. And a mother. Somewhere out there. Daniel's expression darkened. And the bad man? Mercer looked back at the small figure curled up with the dog in the hospital bed. We need to find him, before he finds them. Mercer and Daniels spent the next few hours combing through missing person databases, cross-referencing descriptions, and reaching out to local authorities. The details Emma had given were scarce, but the mention of a large house surrounded by trees gave them a lead. Daniels rubbed his temple. I don't know, man. There's a lot of wooded areas around here, and if she was taken from a house, it could be anywhere. Mercer stared at the map they had pulled up on his laptop. We should start with the places that match her description. Big houses, remote areas. Daniels let out a sigh. All right, let's narrow it down. Mercer typed a few queries into the system, filtering for large properties near dense tree lines. A few hits popped up. One stood out, a house just outside of town, owned by a man with a history of domestic disturbances. No recent reports, but something about it made Mercer's gut tighten. Let's check this one first, he said. Daniels leaned over the screen. Yeah, feels like a long shot, but we don't have much else. Mercer grabbed his keys. We don't wait. If there's a chance Ben and their mother are there, we move now. Daniels followed without argument. As they left, Charlie let out a small bark, his tail wagging uncertainly. Emma looked up from where she was curled on the hospital bed, her eyes wide. Where are you going? She asked, her voice small. Mercer crouched down beside her. We're going to look for your family, Emma. We think we might have found something. Her fingers tightened around Charlie's fur. Be careful. Mercer smiled, ruffling her hair. We will. As he stood, Daniels nudged him. Let's go. The air outside was thick with tension as they drove toward the location. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the roads. Mercer's grip tightened on the wheel. If this was the place, they had to be ready for anything. Mercer drove in silence, his jaw clenched as the headlights of the cruiser cut through the thickening twilight. Daniel sat beside him, eyes glued to the laptop on his lap, cross-checking any additional information they could get on the property. Charlie sat in the back seat, his ears twitching at every turn, as if he could sense they were heading toward something important. All right, so here's what we know about the place, Daniel said, scrolling through the files. Owned by a guy named Walter Grayson, 46 years old. No official criminal record, but neighbors have called in disturbances a few times. Loud noises, screaming, but nothing that ever led to charges. He lives alone. No wife, no kids. And now he suddenly has a mother and 2 kids in his house, Mercer said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Doesn't sit right. Daniel sighed. Yeah, and the fact that he hasn't been reported for anything lately makes me nervous. Either he's been quiet, or people just stopped noticing. Mercer kept his focus on the road as they neared the property. The thick trees cast long shadows, their branches swaying slightly in the evening breeze. The house came into view, an old 2-story structure with peeling paint and overgrown weeds stretching up from the yard. The porch light flickered, casting an eerie glow. They parked just off the road, far enough to approach on foot without immediately alerting anyone. We go in quiet, Mercer said, unbuckling his seatbelt. No sirens, no lights. We don't know what we're walking into. Daniels nodded, checking his firearm before stepping out of the cruiser. Charlie let out a soft whine from the back seat. Mercer gave him a quick pat on the head. Not yet, buddy. Stay put for now. Charlie's ears flattened slightly, but he stayed in place, watching as Mercer and Daniels moved toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar. Mercer exchanged a glance with Daniels. That's not a good sign. Daniels nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. They stepped onto the creaking porch, boots pressing into the warped wood. Mercer pushed the door open slowly, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic. Mercer immediately recognized the coppery smell of blood. Daniels drew his weapon. I don't like this. Mercer moved forward, his eyes scanning the room. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A broken lamp lay in the corner, its bulb shattered. A deep scratch mark ran along the wooden floorboards near the entrance. Then, a sound. A muffled cry. Mercer's pulse kicked up as he gestured for Daniels to follow. They moved carefully, stepping over debris as they followed the sound toward the back of the house. A door was partially open, leading to what looked like a basement stairwell. The cry came again, quieter this time. Mercer took the lead, gripping his gun as he descended the stairs. The air grew colder, damp with the musty scent of mildew. A single flickering light bulb illuminated the basement, casting deep shadows against the stone walls. In the corner, a woman sat curled around a young boy. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt. She clutched the child tightly, shielding him with her body. Mercer lowered his weapon immediately. Ma'am, we're here to help. The woman flinched at first, her grip on the boy tightening. Then she blinked, recognition flashing in her eyes. Emma. Is Emma safe? Mercer nodded. She's safe. She's at the hospital with Charlie. We found her. The boy, likely Ben, peeked out from behind his mother's arm. His face was pale, his blue eyes wide with fear. We need to get you out of here, Daniel said, keeping his voice low. "Is anyone else here? Is Grayson home?" The woman shook her head frantically. "No, he left hours ago, but he said he'd be back." Mercer felt a surge of urgency. "Then we move now. Can you walk?" She nodded, helping Ben to his feet. The boy clung to her, his small hands gripping her torn sweater. Mercer led the way back up the stairs, Daniels covering their backs. The house was still silent, the eerie calm only adding to Mercer's unease. They stepped outside, the cool air hitting them like a wave of relief. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Mercer's stomach dropped. "Move!" Daniels ushered the woman and Ben toward the cruiser as Mercer turned, his hand on his firearm. A rusted truck rumbled down the driveway, its tires crunching against the gravel. The engine cut off, and the driver's side door creaked open. Walter Grayson stepped out, his shadow stretching long against the dirt road. He was a large man, his frame thick with muscle, his face obscured by the dim light. "Well, well," he drawled. "Didn't expect visitors." Mercer held his ground. "They're coming with us. Step away from the vehicle." Grayson tilted his head, a slow smirk forming. "You think you can just take what's mine?" Mercer's grip on his gun tightened. "They're not yours, and if you don't step away, this ends badly for you." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, Grayson lunged. Mercer barely had time to react before the man was on him, knocking the gun from his grip. They tumbled to the ground, fists swinging. Grayson was strong, but Mercer fought with purpose. He twisted, landing a sharp punch to Grayson's ribs before rolling away. Daniels drew his gun. "Freeze!" Grayson hesitated, breathing heavily, his eyes flicking between Mercer and the gun aimed at his chest. Then a growl cut through the air. "Charlie." The golden retriever had slipped from the car and now stood beside Mercer, his teeth bared, his hackles raised. The low, warning snarl sent a clear message. Grayson scoffed. "What? You gonna send your dog after me?" Mercer wiped blood from his lip, nodding toward Charlie. "I don't have to. He's got his own mind, and he knows exactly who the bad guy is." Charlie took a step forward, his growl deepening. Grayson shifted uncomfortably, his bravado cracking just slightly. Sirens wailed in the distance. Daniel smirked. "Looks like backup's here." Grayson stiffened, then bolted for his truck. Charlie lunged, clamping his teeth onto the man's pant leg, yanking him back just enough for Mercer to grab him. Grayson struggled, but Daniels had him cuffed in seconds. Mercer exhaled, looking down at Charlie, who wagged his tail proudly. "Good job, buddy." The golden retriever gave a happy bark, then trotted back to the car, as if his work was done. Mercer turned to the woman and Ben, who stood by the cruiser, their faces filled with relief. "You're safe now," he told them. And this time, he knew it was true. The moment Grayson was cuffed and loaded into the back of a patrol car, Mercer felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. But he knew they weren't done yet. Not even close. The woman and her son were safe for now, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Emma was at the hospital, unaware that her mother and brother had been found, and Mercer wasn't sure how she would react when she saw them again. And then there was Charlie. Loyal, brave Charlie, who had fought tooth and nail to protect Emma. He had been part of this from the start, and Mercer couldn't help but feel that whatever had happened to this family, Charlie had been their one constant protector. Daniels let out a low breath beside him. That could have gone worse. Mercer shook his head. Could have gone better, too. He glanced toward the mother and son, who were huddled together in the back seat of another cruiser. "We need to get them checked out. Make sure they're okay. Then we need to get them to Emma. Daniels nodded. I'll ride with them to the hospital. You follow behind? Mercer nodded, his eyes flicking to Charlie, who stood beside him, his fur bristling as he watched Grayson's patrol car pull away. Mercer crouched down and gave the retriever a scratch behind the ears. You did good, buddy. Charlie let out a soft huff, his tail wagging just slightly, as if he understood that the danger was finally over. The ride back to the hospital was quiet. Mercer kept his hands tight on the wheel, his mind racing through everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. He had found Emma alone in an abandoned house, terrified and clinging to Charlie. He had learned that she had a family out there, somewhere, but had been running from something, or someone, too dangerous for a little girl to explain. And now, finally, they had their answers. The mother and brother had survived, but only barely. Who knew what Grayson would have done if they hadn't gotten there in time? Mercer pulled into the hospital parking lot just as Daniels helped the mother and her son out of the cruiser. Charlie jumped out of Mercer's car the second the door opened and made a beeline for the entrance, stopping only when Mercer whistled him back. Hold up, buddy. Let's take this slow. They entered the hospital together, Mercer leading the way with Charlie at his side. The moment they stepped into the pediatric ward, Emma's small voice rang out. Charlie? Charlie's ears perked up, and before Mercer could say anything, the retriever bolted down the hallway, weaving past nurses and doctors until he skidded to a stop at Emma's bedside. The little girl let out a half laugh, half sob, as she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. Mercer's chest tightened at the sight, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Emma wasn't the only one who needed a reunion tonight. He caught Daniel's eye and nodded. Emma looked up, her smile fading as her gaze shifted past Charlie. She blinked, her small hands gripping the dog's fur tightly as her mother and brother stepped into the room. There was a long, stretched-out moment of silence before the little girl's lip trembled. Mommy. Her mother let out a sob and rushed forward, scooping Emma into her arms. Oh, baby, I'm here. I'm here. Ben joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them, and Mercer had to look away for a moment, feeling like he was intruding on something too raw, too personal. But Charlie stayed right where he was, tail wagging, watching over them like he had always done. The doctors gave the family a clean bill of health, some bruises, exhaustion, and stress, but nothing permanent. They had been lucky. The hardest part would be dealing with the emotional scars left behind. But for now, at least, they had each other. Mercer leaned against the wall outside the hospital room, arms crossed as he watched through the window. Daniels joined him a moment later, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Mercer without a word. After a moment, Daniels spoke. What's going to happen to them? Mercer exhaled. Child Services will probably get involved. The mom will have to give a statement, tell them everything. If there's no immediate risk, they'll let her keep the kids, but she's gonna need help. Daniels nodded slowly. And Charlie? Mercer smiled slightly. I think we already know where he belongs. They watched as Emma reached down, grabbing Charlie's paw and holding it tightly in her small hands. The dog nuzzled her, licking her cheek as she giggled softly. Daniels chuckled. Yeah, he's not going anywhere. Mercer took a sip of his coffee. The night had been long, but for the first time since it had started, he felt like they had done something good, something right. And maybe, just maybe, Charlie had known it all along. Mercer watched the reunion unfold from a distance, arms crossed, exhaustion settling in his bones. The emotional weight of the past day pressed down on him, but he knew they weren't done yet. The questions surrounding Emma, her mother, and Ben still lingered. There was paperwork to file, statements to take, and the looming uncertainty of what would happen to them in the long run. Charlie lay on the floor beside Emma's hospital bed, his large frame curled protectively against the side of the mattress. The dog had yet to leave her side, even as the doctors and nurses moved in and out of the room. Emma had fallen asleep, her small fingers still buried in Charlie's fur. Her mother sat in the chair beside her, gently stroking Ben's hair as he leaned against her. Daniels nudged Mercer's arm, breaking the moment of quiet. "So, what now?" Mercer sighed. "Grayson's in custody, but we'll need the mother's full statement to make everything stick. She's not ready for that yet. We'll give her time." Daniels took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the scene in front of them. "And after that?" Mercer shook his head. "That's not up to us. Child Services will get involved. They'll decide whether Emma and Ben stay with their mother or if they need to be placed somewhere else." Daniels let out a long breath. "I hate this part. You do everything right, bring people to safety, and then someone else decides their fate." Mercer understood that frustration all too well. He had seen families torn apart because of bureaucracy, red tape, and the cold calculations of a system that often failed to see people as more than case numbers. He hoped it wouldn't come to that for Emma and Ben. The mother, Samantha, they now knew, glanced up from her children and caught Mercer's gaze through the window. She mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." Mercer nodded. "We should check in with the station. Make sure Grayson isn't trying to pull anything." Daniels finished the last of his coffee and tossed the cup into a nearby trash bin. "You think he's got a shot at getting out?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." At the station, the air buzzed with the usual activity: officers processing cases, dispatchers handling calls, and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mercer and Daniels made their way to the holding area, where Walter Grayson sat behind a set of metal bars, his hands resting on his lap, his expression unreadable. Grayson lifted his gaze as they approached, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. "Deputies," he drawled. "Come to gloat?" Mercer kept his expression neutral. "Just making sure you're comfortable." Grayson leaned back against the bench, stretching out as much as the small cell allowed. "Didn't think you had it in you, Mercer, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Daniels folded his arms. "Saving 2 kids and their mother from a psycho? Yeah, that's exactly where our noses belong." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you've won?" Mercer narrowed his eyes. "We know what you did. You're not walking away from this." Grayson's smirk didn't falter. "People like me? We always find a way?" Daniels bristled, but Mercer held up a hand, signaling him to stay calm. He wasn't about to let Grayson get under their skin. "Enjoy your time here, Grayson. It's the closest thing to freedom you'll have for a long time." As they turned to leave, Grayson's voice followed them. "We'll see about that." Mercer ignored him, walking back toward the main office. The words slithered in his mind like a warning, but he pushed them aside. He had more important things to focus on. Back at the hospital, Emma had woken up, and Mercer found himself sitting beside her bed while Charlie remained curled at her feet. She watched him with wide eyes, as if trying to piece together everything that had happened. Her mother and Ben had stepped out momentarily to speak with a social worker. "Are we safe now?" Emma asked quietly. Mercer nodded. "Yeah, kiddo. You're safe." Emma's fingers ran through Charlie's fur absent-mindedly. "What's going to happen to us?" Mercer hesitated before answering. "The social workers are going to talk to your mom. They want to make sure you and Ben have everything you need." Emma frowned. "Does that mean we have to go somewhere else?" Mercer wished he could give her a definitive answer, but that wasn't his call to make. "I don't know yet. But I promise no one is going to take you away unless they have to. Emma's grip on Charlie tightened. Can we stay with Charlie? Mercer smiled slightly. I think Charlie's already decided he's not leaving you. Charlie let out a soft huff, licking Emma's hand as if to confirm it. The door opened, and Samantha stepped back inside, followed closely by Ben. The social worker had left, at least for now. Samantha met Mercer's gaze, searching for something in his expression. Can we go home? She asked. Mercer hesitated, then nodded. Not yet, but soon. Samantha exhaled and sat beside Emma, pulling her daughter close. Thank you, Deputy Mercer, for everything. Mercer nodded. Just doing my job. He turned toward Charlie, who gave him a knowing look. It wasn't over yet, but at least for now they had a chance to breathe. And that was enough. Mercer stepped outside the hospital, the cold night air filling his lungs as he exhaled slowly. He rubbed his hands together, his mind still turning over everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Grayson was in a cell where he belonged, but the uneasy feeling in Mercer's gut hadn't left him. Daniels leaned against the cruiser, sipping from a cup of coffee. You look like you haven't slept in a month. Mercer let out a dry chuckle. Feels like it. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, glancing back toward the hospital doors. They're talking to child services now, trying to figure out their next steps. Daniels nodded, looking off toward the empty parking lot. Think she'll get to keep him? Mercer let out a slow breath. I don't know. Samantha's strong, but everything they've been through, it's a lot. They'll need help. Daniels was quiet for a moment before he said, What about Charlie? Mercer smirked. That dog isn't going anywhere. He's stuck to Emma like glue. Charlie was curled up inside the hospital room, his golden fur rising and falling with each steady breath as he lay at Emma's feet. She hadn't let go of him since they found her, and Mercer doubted she ever would. Daniel sighed and took another sip of coffee. Think Grayson's got more trouble brewing? Mercer's jaw tightened. He as much as told us he did. Grayson had made a career out of slipping through the cracks. Even now, locked in a holding cell, he had the air of a man who believed he still had control over the situation. Mercer had seen too many like him before. Dangerous men who thought they were untouchable. The problem was, sometimes they were right. Daniels shifted his weight. You think he's got friends? Mercer frowned, thinking back to what little they knew about Grayson's connections. He never did this alone. There's someone else out there. We just don't know who yet. Daniels cursed under his breath. Well, we better figure it out before they do. Mercer nodded. He had no doubt Grayson had more pieces in play, and the last thing he wanted was for the man's reach to extend beyond his cell. The sound of the hospital doors sliding open caught their attention. Samantha stepped out, Ben trailing close behind her. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, but there was something stronger in her eyes now. Social worker says we need a safe place to stay while they sort things out, she said. They have a shelter, but Mercer didn't like the idea any more than she did. A shelter meant little privacy, no real security. If Grayson had people on the outside, it wouldn't be hard to track them down. You can't go back home, Mercer said firmly. Not yet. Samantha nodded. I know. Daniels glanced at Mercer. You thinking what I'm thinking? Mercer sighed. I might know a place. An hour later, they pulled up to a quiet house on the outskirts of town. It was a small, unassuming place with a wraparound porch and a single light, glowing in the window. Mercer parked the car and turned to Samantha. You'll be safe here. It's off the radar." Samantha hesitated, but nodded. "Whose place is this?" Mercer cut the engine. "Someone I trust." They got out, and Charlie hopped down, immediately standing beside Emma as she clung to his fur. Mercer led the way to the front door and knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened, revealing an older woman with short, graying hair and sharp eyes that immediately softened when she saw Mercer. "Scott," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "Didn't expect to see you at this hour." "Didn't expect to be here," Mercer admitted. The woman's gaze shifted to Samantha, then to the two children standing quietly behind her. Emma clutched Charlie's fur, half hiding behind him. "This them?" the woman asked. Mercer nodded. "Yeah, they need a safe place." The woman studied Samantha for a moment before giving a decisive nod. "Come in then. We'll figure it out." Samantha hesitated but stepped inside, ushering Emma and Ben in with her. Charlie followed, his tail wagging slightly as he sniffed around the unfamiliar space. Mercer met the woman's gaze. "Thanks, Jean." Jean waved him off. "Don't thank me yet. Just tell me what we're up against." Mercer stepped inside and shut the door behind him. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. Jean closed the door behind them, locking it out of habit. The house smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, a combination that somehow made Mercer relax, even if only slightly. He had been here before, years ago. Jean had been a friend of his late mother, a tough woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. But she had a heart, one that rarely turned away people who needed help. She gave Samantha and the kids a once-over before turning to Mercer. "Get them settled. I'll make some tea." Samantha hesitated at the threshold, her arms wrapped protectively around Ben, while Emma clung to Charlie. The golden retriever stayed close, his head high, his body language alert yet calm. "Come on," Mercer said gently, guiding them to the living room. The house was simple but cozy. A fireplace crackled in the corner, and a couch with a faded quilt draped over the back looked inviting despite its wear. Ben sat down first, his hands clenched in his lap. Emma climbed up beside him, one hand still gripping Charlie's fur. Jean returned with a tray of tea and a few cookies. "This house isn't fancy, but it's safe," she said, setting the tray down. "Drink up? You look like you need it." Samantha took a cup, her fingers trembling slightly around the ceramic. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." Jean waved a hand. "You don't? But you do tell me everything I need to know so I can help keep you safe." Samantha glanced at Mercer, who gave her a reassuring nod. "It's all right. She's with us." She let out a shaky breath, then started talking. She told them everything she could remember about Grayson, about the house in the woods, about how she had tried to escape with Ben and Emma. Mercer listened intently, filling in the gaps with what they already knew. Grayson had been controlling, manipulative, and violent. He had isolated her from the outside world, kept her children under his watch, and ruled through fear. Jean listened, occasionally sipping her tea, her sharp eyes never leaving Samantha. When the story was done, she set her cup down with a decisive clink. "We need to make sure he doesn't find you." Mercer leaned forward. "We have him in custody, but he's not alone. He had help. We don't know how deep this goes yet." Jean nodded. "Then we plan for worst-case scenario." Samantha's grip on her cup tightened. "Do you think he'll come after us?" Jean's gaze was steady. Men like him don't like to lose. The room fell into silence, save for the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Charlie let out a soft huff and nuzzled closer to Emma, sensing her unease. Mercer reached out and gently patted the dog's head. "You're safe here," Mercer assured them. "But we have to be smart." Daniels called just after midnight. Mercer stepped outside to take it, the cold air a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. "We got a problem," Daniels said without preamble. Mercer tensed. "What is it?" "Grayson lawyered up fast, and not just any lawyer, someone with power, someone who's already poking holes in the case." Mercer cursed under his breath. "You serious?" "Yeah. He's claiming unlawful arrest, lack of evidence, the whole 9 yards. If his people keep working the system, he could be out sooner than we expected." Mercer clenched his jaw. "We have Samantha's statement. That should be enough to keep him in." Daniels hesitated. "It should. But if we don't find more, they could argue it down. And if he gets out..." Mercer knew what he meant. If Grayson got out, he would come looking for them. For Samantha. For Ben. For Emma. For revenge. "We need to dig deeper," Mercer said. "Find out who he's connected to." Daniels sighed. "Already working on it. But we need time." Mercer glanced back at the house. Inside, Emma was curled up against Charlie, her small form relaxed for the first time since he had met her. Samantha was speaking softly with Jean. They deserved time to heal, time to breathe. But time wasn't on their side. "I'll do what I can," Mercer said before hanging up. When he stepped back inside, Jean was watching him. "Bad news?" Mercer exhaled. "Nothing we can't handle. But we need to be ready." Jean nodded. "Always." Samantha looked up, concern clear in her eyes. "What happened?" Mercer hesitated before telling her the truth. "Grayson's trying to work the system. He might not stay locked up as long as we hoped." Samantha paled. "No." Emma stirred, blinking up at them sleepily. Charlie raised his head, ears alert. "It's okay," Mercer said quickly. "We won't let anything happen to you." Jean tapped her fingers against the armrest of her chair. "Then we prepare for that possibility. If he gets out, we make sure he can't reach them." Samantha pulled Ben close. "How do we do that?" Jean gave a small, knowing smile. "We play smarter than him." Mercer met Jean's gaze and nodded. Whatever happened next, they wouldn't face it unprepared. Charlie let out a soft woof, as if in agreement, and for the first time in a long time, Mercer believed they might actually have a chance. The night stretched long, quiet, except for the occasional rustling of trees outside. Mercer stood by the window, watching the shadows shift under the moonlight. His gut told him they had little time before Grayson's influence started seeping through the cracks of the legal system. Behind him, Jean sat at the dining table, her fingers idly drumming against the wood. Samantha sat beside her, a cup of untouched tea in her hands, her eyes distant. Emma and Ben had fallen asleep on the couch, Charlie curled protectively between them, his ears twitching at even the slightest sound. Jean finally broke the silence. "So, what's the next move?" Mercer sighed. "Daniels is looking into Grayson's connections, but we both know guys like him don't operate alone. If someone with enough pull gets involved, he won't be behind bars for long." Samantha's grip tightened on her cup. "If he gets out..." Mercer turned to her. "We won't let him get to you, but we need to be ready for anything." Jean nodded, reaching for a notepad. "Then let's start thinking ahead." They spent the next hour laying out potential plans. The house was off the grid enough to buy them some time, but if Grayson had resources, it wouldn't take long for someone to track them down. They needed a backup location, an emergency exit plan. Jean had a few trusted friends, people who wouldn't ask questions but would offer shelter if needed. As they worked through possibilities, Mercer's phone buzzed. He stepped away from the table and answered it, keeping his voice low. "Talk to me." Daniel's voice came through, tense. "We've got a problem." Mercer clenched his jaw. "How bad?" "Grayson's lawyer just put in a request for bail, and given the judge assigned to this case, there's a good chance he'll be out by morning." Mercer's pulse quickened. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. We need something stronger to keep him locked up. A new charge, more evidence, something airtight." Mercer looked back at Samantha, her face pale as she tried to remain composed. He lowered his voice. "Then we better find it fast." Daniels exhaled. "I'll keep digging, but you need to be prepared. If he walks, he'll come looking." Mercer ended the call and turned back to the group. Their eyes were on him, waiting, expecting. Jean spoke first. "That was about Grayson, wasn't it?" Mercer gave a tight nod. "Bail hearing in the morning. Judge might let him walk." Samantha sucked in a breath, her fingers tightening around the ceramic cup so hard Mercer thought it might crack. "Then what do we do?" Mercer sat down, pressing his palms against the table. "We make sure we're 10 steps ahead of him." Ben stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily. Emma still had a tight hold on Charlie, even in sleep. The dog didn't move, only let out a low exhale, as if sensing the tension in the room. Jean leaned forward. "We need to move before he does." Samantha hesitated. "Move where?" Jean met Mercer's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them before she answered. Somewhere he'd never think to look. The next few hours were a blur. Jean made a few calls, calling in favors from people Mercer had never met but trusted by association. A safe house, farther out, deeper in the woods where no one would stumble upon them. No paper trail, no easy way in or out. By dawn, they were packed and ready. Mercer watched as Samantha gathered what little belongings they had, helping Ben into a coat that was a size too big. Emma clung to Charlie, whispering softly to the retriever as though he could offer her reassurance. Jean handed Mercer a set of keys. "Take my truck. Less likely to be recognized." Mercer took them without argument. "You sure about this?" Jean smirked. "You think this is the first time I've had to help someone disappear?" Samantha exhaled, trying to steady herself. "How long do we have?" Mercer checked his watch. "Not long. If the judge grants bail, Grayson will be out within the next couple of hours. He'll come looking." Samantha swallowed hard and nodded. "Then we should go." Mercer opened the front door, scanning the area before ushering them toward the truck. The morning air was crisp, the sky still painted with streaks of early light. Charlie hopped into the back seat, Emma right beside him. Ben climbed in after them, and Samantha slid into the passenger seat. Mercer started the engine, glancing at Jean one last time. "Thank you." Jean gave him a small nod. "Just make sure they stay safe." With that, Mercer pulled out onto the road, heading toward the unknown. They drove for hours, winding through back roads, avoiding main highways. Samantha kept glancing out the window, her grip on the door handle tight. Ben sat quietly, staring down at his hands. Emma dozed off against Charlie, her small frame curled up next to the retriever. Eventually, the trees thickened, and Mercer turned down a narrow dirt path that led to a secluded cabin, barely visible through the dense woods. He parked and turned to Samantha. "This is it." She stared at the cabin, then back at him. "And you trust this place?" Mercer nodded. "Jean's friend owns it. They're out of town for a while, No one will look for you here." Samantha let out a slow breath. All right. They got out, stretching stiff limbs as Mercer unlocked the door. The inside was simple, but functional. Basic furniture, a fireplace, a small kitchen. A safe haven for now. Emma rubbed her eyes and yawned. "Where's Charlie gonna sleep?" Mercer smiled. "Anywhere he wants." Charlie wagged his tail, already sniffing around the new space. Ben set his bag down, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Samantha let out a deep breath, one that seemed to carry some of the weight she had been holding. Mercer closed the door behind them. For now, they were safe. But for how long, he wasn't sure. The cabin was quiet, except for the faint crackle of the fire Mercer had started in the small stone hearth. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the roof and windows. Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly, her eyes focused on some unseen point in the wood grain. Ben sat on the floor near the fireplace, slowly turning the pages of an old picture book Jean had left behind. Emma was curled up on the couch with Charlie, her small fingers still tangled in his fur. Mercer leaned against the doorframe, watching them. They were safe for now, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. How long would it last? He knew Grayson was a dangerous man. Even if the judge delayed his bail or denied it outright, Grayson's influence ran deep. Someone, somewhere, was working to get him out. And when that happened, Mercer needed to be ready. Jean had called earlier to let him know that she was still digging into Grayson's connections. So far, nothing concrete. No paper trails, no obvious accomplices, just whispers of a man who knew how to cover his tracks. Mercer hated not having a clear picture. It made him feel like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Samantha broke the silence. "I don't know how to do this," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Her voice was strained, the weight of the past few days pulling at every word. "I've been running for so long, I don't know how to stop." Mercer stepped into the room. "You don't have to figure it out all at once. Just take it one step at a time." She looked up at him, her expression both tired and wary. "What if he finds us again? What if—" Mercer held her gaze. "We'll be ready. He won't get the chance to hurt you or your kids again." Samantha hesitated, then nodded slightly. She glanced over at Emma, her expression softening as she watched her daughter doze against Charlie. "She hasn't slept like that in weeks. Not since—" she trailed off, but Mercer understood. "Not since the day they ran. The day Grayson crossed the line she couldn't forgive." He didn't press her for details. She had already given enough. Instead, he walked over to the couch and crouched down beside Emma, adjusting the quilt so it covered her properly. Charlie shifted slightly, just enough to let Mercer tuck it in before settling back down. "Good boy," Mercer murmured, scratching behind the retriever's ears. Charlie huffed softly, his eyes half closed, but alert. Ben looked up from his book. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Samantha turned toward her son, her mouth opening to answer, but Mercer spoke first. "No, just for a little while, until we know it's safe to move on." Ben nodded, his young face serious. "I don't want to go back." "You won't," Mercer promised. "Not unless you choose to." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he returned his attention to the book, though he didn't seem to be reading the words. Mercer straightened and moved to the kitchen. Samantha followed, her footsteps soft. "You're good with them," she said quietly. Mercer shrugged. "I've seen enough to know what scares kids. And I know what helps." "Have you done this before?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Helped people like us?" "Not exactly," Mercer admitted. "But I've dealt with situations where people needed protection, where they needed someone to stand between them and the danger." Samantha studied him, as if weighing his words. "You're risking a lot by helping us." "It's not about risk. It's about what's right," Mercer said simply. "Grayson isn't going to win, not this time." Her expression softened slightly, and she nodded. "Thank you." Mercer nodded back, then glanced out the window. The rain had picked up, falling steadily now, though the cabin remained dry and warm. He watched the tree line, his instincts always scanning for anything out of place. Later that night, after Ben and Emma had gone to bed, Mercer and Samantha sat by the fire, the low flames casting flickering shadows across the room. She spoke in halting sentences, opening up about the years of control and fear she had lived under, about the lies Grayson had told, the isolation he had imposed, and the final breaking point that forced her to flee. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make him angry, he'd eventually calm down. That things would go back to how they were in the beginning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it never got better. It only got worse." Mercer listened, not interrupting, not pushing for more than she was willing to share. He knew from experience that sometimes just being heard was the first step toward healing. She took a shaky breath. "I don't want them to grow up thinking this is normal, that being afraid all the time is just how life is." "They won't," Mercer said firmly. "They've already seen how strong you are. You got them out. You made the hard choice to leave." Samantha looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What if it's not enough? What if he finds us and I can't stop him?" "You're not alone," Mercer reminded her. "You've got people standing with you now, and that makes all the difference." For the first time that night, she smiled. It was faint, but it was real. And for Mercer, that was enough. They weren't out of danger yet, but as long as they kept moving forward, as long as they didn't give up, there was hope. Charlie let out a contented sigh from his spot near the fireplace, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Mercer glanced down at the dog and felt a quiet sense of reassurance. Charlie hadn't given up on them, and Mercer wouldn't either. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the sound of the rain still pattering softly against the cabin roof. Mercer was up before anyone else, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out the small kitchen window. The trees were a thick, tangled mass of green and brown, the kind of woods that could easily hide someone, or something, if they didn't know the lay of the land. Mercer had spent enough time in places like this to understand that the isolation was both a comfort and a risk. It gave them time, but it also made them harder to find if help was needed in a hurry. Samantha appeared in the doorway, her face drawn but more alert than it had been the night before. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her and moved to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Sleep okay?" Mercer asked. She nodded, blowing on the coffee before taking a tentative sip. "Better than I have in a while." "Good." Mercer leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I'm gonna step out and check the perimeter in a bit. Make sure everything's still quiet." Samantha's grip on the mug tightened slightly. "You think someone could find us here?" "I think it's always better to be prepared," Mercer said honestly. "We can't take anything for granted." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the steaming coffee. "I appreciate everything you're doing. I know it's not easy for you either." Mercer gave her a faint smile. "We do what we have to." As he stepped outside, the crisp air bit at his cheeks. He pulled his jacket tighter and began a slow circuit of the cabin's immediate surroundings. The rain-soaked ground squelched under his boots, and the forest smelled rich and earthy. His eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush, the narrow trail leading up to the cabin. Everything seemed untouched. The only signs of life, the occasional squirrel darting up a tree, or the sound of a bird calling from the canopy. Satisfied for the moment, Mercer returned to the cabin. Samantha was now sitting at the table, eating a piece of toast, while Charlie sat at her feet, watching her closely. "He's really attached to you guys," Mercer said, nodding toward the dog. Samantha smiled faintly. "He's been a lifesaver. I don't know how we would have made it this far without him." Mercer crouched down and scratched Charlie behind the ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his tail wagging slightly. "Good boy, Charlie," Mercer murmured. "You're doing good." As the morning wore on, Emma and Ben woke up, rubbing their eyes and yawning as they stumbled into the kitchen. Mercer fixed them some cereal while Samantha brewed more coffee. The simple routine of breakfast, of being together in the warmth of the cabin, felt almost normal. But the tension wasn't far beneath the surface. They all knew that this peace was temporary. Jean called mid-morning. Mercer stepped outside to take the call, leaning against the side of the cabin as he listened. "Still no solid leads on who's backing Grayson," Jean said, her voice tight. "He's got friends, but they're careful. No paper trail, no obvious money transfers. It's like trying to catch smoke." Mercer clenched his jaw. "What about the judge? Any chance they'll keep him locked up?" Jean sighed. "Slim. Even if they deny bail, his lawyer will push for another hearing. They'll keep hammering until they find a loophole." "Then we need to find something first," Mercer said, his tone firm. "Something that sticks." "I'm working on it," Jean said. "But you need to be ready. If he gets out—" "I know," Mercer cut in. "I'm ready." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, the cold air sharp against his face. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly before heading back inside. Samantha was sitting with the kids, helping Emma untangle her hair while Ben flipped through another book. Charlie had stretched out near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. Mercer gave them a quick smile. "Everything's quiet out there?" Samantha looked up, her expression guarded, but grateful. "Good." The day passed slowly, a mix of small tasks and quiet conversations. Mercer checked the cabin's generator, made sure the pantry was stocked with what they had brought, and kept an eye on the woods. Samantha spent time with the kids, doing her best to keep them occupied. Emma drew pictures on scraps of paper Jean had left, mostly of Charlie and the cabin. Ben tried to help Mercer fix a loose step on the porch, though he was more interested in holding the flashlight than doing any actual work. As night fell, the cabin felt even more isolated. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest dripping and quiet. Mercer sat by the window, watching the tree line, his instincts on high alert. He didn't expect trouble tonight, but he didn't trust the calm. Grayson's reach was long, and Mercer knew that sooner or later someone would come looking. Samantha joined him, her arms crossed as she stared out the window alongside him. "Do you think we'll ever have a normal life again?" Mercer glanced at her. "What's normal?" She smiled faintly. "I guess I don't even know anymore." "You will," Mercer said. "It'll take time, but you'll get there. One step at a time." She nodded, her gaze drifting back to the woods. "Thanks for not giving up on us." "Not an option," Mercer said simply. Charlie let out a soft woof from his spot by the fireplace, as if agreeing. Samantha smiled at the sound, and for a moment the cabin felt a little warmer, a little safer. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were holding on. The following morning, Mercer was out of bed before sunrise, his instincts pulling him back outside. The air was crisp and still, the ground damp with dew as he scanned the surrounding woods. His eyes moved over the trail, the faint path they'd taken to reach the cabin. Something about it made him uneasy. Something wrong? Samantha's voice came from the porch, soft and cautious. She was wrapped in her cardigan, her hair still mussed from sleep. "I'm not sure," Mercer admitted, not taking his eyes off the trail. "Could just be my imagination. But we can't afford to be careless." Samantha stepped down off the porch, her bare feet silent on the damp wood. She stood beside him, her arms crossed. "You think someone's found us?" Mercer shook his head. "Not yet. But if Grayson has people out there, they'll be looking." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the faint chirp of early birds. Finally, Mercer turned to her. "You trust me, right?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes." "Then we keep going. One day at a time." She nodded again, her eyes steady. "All right." The day stretched long and uneventful, but the tension never fully left. Mercer and Samantha worked together to strengthen the cabin's defenses, checking the locks, reinforcing the doors, and making sure the windows were secure. Charlie followed them around, his tail wagging as if he thought the whole thing was a game. Even Emma and Ben got involved, fetching tools and holding flashlight beams while Mercer made adjustments. It wasn't much, but it helped keep their minds off the looming threat. By nightfall, the cabin felt a little more fortified, and the routine they'd fallen into was starting to feel comforting. Dinner was a quiet affair, everyone sitting around the small table as the fire crackled in the background. Emma giggled at something Ben whispered, and even Samantha smiled as she watched her children relax, if only for a moment. After the kids were tucked into bed, Samantha lingered in the living room. Mercer sat in his usual spot near the fireplace, Charlie at his feet. The room was dim, lit only by the fading glow of the fire. Samantha sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Mercer," she began softly. "Thank you. For everything, I don't know where we'd be without you." He met her gaze, his expression serious. "You'd be exactly where you are now, because you're stronger than you think. You made the decision to leave. You got your kids out. I'm just here to make sure you stay safe." She looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You don't give yourself enough credit." He didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth lifted slightly in acknowledgement. The fire crackled softly, and Charlie let out a contented sigh. For a few minutes, they just sat there, the quiet filling the space between them. As the night deepened, Mercer's thoughts turned back to Grayson. He didn't know when or how the man would make his next move, but he felt the pressure of it building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had to stay one step ahead. And if that meant waiting in the shadows, ready to act at a moment's notice, so be it. Charlie stirred, lifting his head as if sensing Mercer's unease. The dog looked at him, then laid his head back down as if to say, "I'm here." Mercer reached down and ran his fingers through the dog's fur. "Good boy," he murmured. And for the first time in a long while, Mercer felt a flicker of hope. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough. By the time Mercer opened the front door the next morning, the world outside was cloaked in a heavy mist that clung to the trees and muted every sound. He stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the quiet, his hand resting on the old wooden railing. It was the kind of morning that felt suspended in time, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Inside, Samantha and the kids were stirring. Charlie padded out from the living room, stretching his long legs before nudging Mercer's hip with his nose. The dog looked up at him, his expressive eyes asking a silent question. Mercer crouched down and ruffled Charlie's fur. "Everything's fine, buddy. Just another quiet morning." Charlie let out a soft huff and sat beside him, keeping watch as the mist began to shift, the sunlight slowly piercing through in thin rays. Mercer sipped from his coffee mug, savoring the warmth as the cool morning air wrapped around him. For a brief moment, he let himself imagine what life could be like if this were the new normal. Peaceful mornings, the kids laughing inside, Charlie keeping them safe. But the thought didn't last long. He knew better than to get comfortable. Jean called not long after breakfast. Mercer stepped into the small hallway to take the call, his voice low. "What do you have?" "Not much, I'm afraid," Jean said, frustration clear in her tone. "Grayson's lawyer filed another motion. He's not out yet, but he's fighting hard. The judge is leaning toward denying bail, but it's not a done deal." Mercer pinched the bridge of his nose. "So we're still in limbo." "Yeah. And until we have more on his backers, I don't know how much longer we can keep him in there. I'll keep digging." "Thanks, Jean." Mercer ended the call, his stomach twisting. He stepped back into the main room where Samantha was helping Emma with her hair, patiently untangling the small knots. Ben was flipping through another book at the kitchen table, his lips moving silently as he tried to sound out words. Charlie lay on the rug near the fireplace, watching them all with quiet contentment. "They've adjusted well," Mercer commented, nodding toward the kids. Samantha looked up, a small smile playing at her lips. "They have. It's the first time they've felt safe in a long time." Mercer's chest tightened at the thought. "They'll stay safe. I'll make sure of it." Samantha's eyes lingered on him, gratitude and something else, something unspoken, passing between them. She nodded. "I know." As the day stretched on, Mercer turned his attention to reinforcing the cabin's defenses even further. He worked on the locks, added an extra layer of protection to the windows, and walked the perimeter again, checking for anything out of place. Charlie followed at his side, his presence steady and reassuring. Together they combed through the woods, marking any paths or trails that seemed suspicious. Mercer wanted to be prepared for anything. In the late afternoon, he took a break on the porch, leaning back in a weathered chair, as Charlie sat at his feet. Samantha joined him a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one and sat in the chair next to his. "Have you always been so careful?" she asked, her tone curious. Mercer smiled faintly. "Comes with the job. You see enough bad situations, you learn to be prepared for the worst." "Does it ever get easier?" He looked out at the trees, considering her question. "Not easier. But you learn to manage it. To keep going, even when it feels overwhelming." Samantha nodded slowly, sipping her tea. "I guess that's what we're doing. Just keeping going." "That's all you can do," Mercer said. He glanced at her, his expression softening. "And you're doing it well." She smiled, a genuine smile that made her look lighter, less burdened. "Thank you." Charlie let out a contented sigh, stretching out on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the forest. For the first time in days, Mercer allowed himself to feel a small measure of peace. The storm hadn't arrived yet. They still had time to prepare, to fortify, to hold their ground. And that was enough for now.